Welcome. This is Getting Started with Lightning Navigation. I'm Andrew Huffman, and I'll be guiding you through the new Lightning Navigation APIs. So before I get started, the forward-looking statement that you've seen, make sure that you make any purchasing decisions based off of products and features that are already existing. So again, I'm Andrew Huffman. I work on the Lightning Navigation Services team. And the audience with me is Akshatha. She's our product manager. She'll be joining me later to help answer questions. So let's get into it. All right. So as you probably are aware, Lightning is a single-page app. That means that once the page is loaded, all the subsequent navigations are handled entirely within the browser. That means that the browser is doing all the work. It determines what component to display for a given URL. It has to swap out old components and put in the new components when you navigate to a new page. That also means that we have to do some caching to improve performance on back navigations and re-navigations of the same page. We manage the browser history through the HTML5 history API. Back about a year ago, you might have noticed there used to be a #/lightning in the URL. That's gone now. It causes lots of different issues. And because of all this, that's required us to create a reliable framework to manage this URL to component resolution. And that framework, to enable that framework, we've created a service called Navigation Service that handles navigations to and from any Lightning page, as well as centering our navigation APIs around the concept of page references. Now, it's important to note that these are different than Visualforce page references. If you're familiar with Visualforce, we just happen to share the same name. So what are some of the features for the Lightning navigation? Well, of course, first is navigation. That's the ability to resolve a component for a given URL or page reference. An API for you to use programmatically to handle those navigations. You can also use it to manipulate the history, so you can do redirections. And so in Aura, in order to do this, you would include the Lightning navigation component. And in LWC, you would extend the navigation mixin from the Lightning navigation module. You can also use the API to generate URLs from a page reference. This means you don't have to be crafting them by hand anymore. You can use the generate URL API, and it'll generate you a URL from a page reference. And the way you use it is much the same as it is with navigations. So this is kind of where some of the more the power comes in. We also provide you the ability to have page context. This is injected into your component using the current page context is injected to your component. This allows you to persist the state to the URL for deep linking, for you to manipulate the way their component looks, and so forth. In Aura, to use this, you would use the Lightning has page reference interface, and in LWC, you'd use an @wire with the current page reference as obtained from Lightning navigation. And finally, URL addressable components. This is the ability to navigate directly to a component without having to have an admin, create you a tab or anything like that. You can just implement this Lightning is URL addressable in an Aura component, and you'll be able to navigate to that page. This replaces the navigate to component event. If you're aware of that, that's now deprecated and will be end of lifed. So it's important that you migrate anything over into this new paradigm. So I'm going to give a concrete, take a step back. And before we had all these events, we had navigate to list, navigate to SObject, navigate to array list. As you can imagine, this doesn't scale. So every time we had a new page, we had to create a new event. So that doesn't really make sense. There's also some other issues with using events that make it less flexible. So we've combined all these concepts into a single interface through the Lightning navigation module and provided APIs that you can call centering around page references. So the way that looks is that previously you would have had an event. Like if you wanted to go to a record page, you would have created a navigate to SObject event, set some parameters on it, and then fired it. Now what you'll do is you'll use the navigation service, and then you'll just call navigate on it using a page reference. So page references, I keep on talking about it, but what are they? Well, it's just an object literal. There's nothing too fancy about it. But what it is a structured representation of a URL. So every URL corresponds to a page reference, and every page reference can be generated into a URL. And this is used by our routing framework and all our APIs in order to help navigations, as well as resolving URLs back into page references. There are 3 properties on a page reference. The type, which tells you what type of page that page reference corresponds to. The attributes, which are the required fields necessary to render that page. So, for instance, the record ID for a record page. And these will be in the URI segments. And finally, an optional state data. These are query parameters that are tacked onto the URL and will be used. You can use it to manipulate your component in whichever ways you want. So here's a concrete example. This is a URL for account home. Of course, we have a domain and the Lightning prefix. That won't change. With this next segment, /o here corresponds to the type. In this case, standard object page. Then we have the next segment, account, corresponds to the object API name. And the next segment here, list, corresponds to the action name. And then finally, the state here, filter name, recent, corresponds to the query parameters. So we have a number of page references. I'm not going to go into these right now. You can look it up if you just look up Lightning page reference types. But we have, I think, 10 right now. I'm sure we'll be adding more. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the Mascots app. So this is an app I created that has mascots records. It's got, we have a custom entity called mascot. We have this page launch point that allows you to get there. And we have a context tab that you can have multiple views on. The corresponding slides will have videos that correspond to this app. So for the Navigate APIs, what you can do with it is, of course, navigate. So it's not too exciting. If you click on one of these buttons, it's calling a navigate to, and it's going to that next page. We also support deep linking. So you can see here, there's a drop down here where the user can change the filter. As that user changes the filter, you can see that it changes the state here. And then when that user clicks on contacts, it will provide that filter to the next page. So in this case, the contacts list is filtered by mascots. We also support redirection. So this is the second parameter where you provide replace. In this case, this user wants to go to Appy, the Appy mascot. It actually first goes to the mascots tab, which then redirects it to the Appy card. But when the user hits the back button, they go back to the launch point as opposed to that intermediate page. This prevents you from getting in a real annoying situation where the user hits back and they end up getting redirected back to the same page they just came from. So what does this look like? In Aura, what you do is you include the Lightning navigation component. You would give it an Aura ID, and then you'll reference it back in some event handler. In this case, a Lightning button has an on-click handler that calls go to page. It references that navigation services and calls navigate on it with some page reference and an optional second parameter for whether or not to replace the history. In LWC, it's a little bit different. In this case, you will actually bring in import navigation mixin from the Lightning navigation module. You'll have your component extend navigation mixin parameterized over Lightning element. This will actually inject into your component a couple methods. The syntax here is kind of weird, but essentially this is a method now that is available to your component, navigation mixin.navigate. This corresponds to the navigate call in the Aura environment. And again, you just provide a page reference as the first parameter and a replace parameter for the second. So generating URLs. As you can see here, there's several. Each of these has a page reference corresponding to it, and then a URL that's been generated with it. As the user changes the filters here, it's updating the URLs, and it's updating the page reference, which actually then updates the URL. So what you can do with this is you can use it to future-proof your links. This way, you're not handcrafting your links. You're actually having those links get generated for you using the navigation service APIs. This way, the users, in this case, these links have been generated for you to go to the record home, or I'm sorry, the record view page or the record edit page. And what's more important about this, though, is it allows you to create user-friendly links. So previously, if you were using an event on Click, it would, if you were to right-click and open up a new tab, then it would be going to JavaScript void because you had an on-click handler that fired an event. You wouldn't actually have an href in that URL. So by generating URLs, you can actually have it so that the users can right-click or copy the URL or open up a new tab. So what does this look like? Very similar. Oops. Very similar to the previous example. In this case, you would bring the navigation service APIs through Lightning Navigation. You want to have some sort of property, some sort of attribute for your URLs that you'll then reference through a data binding into a link component. In this case, I'm using Lightning formatted URL. And I want to take a second to point out Lightning formatted URL is what you would want to use because it will actually intercept the click handling and then underneath the covers do a navigate call. If you don't do that, if you use a raw anchor, what actually happens is it goes to the server and it'll rebootstrap the app and it'll be a much worse user experience. So if you use Lightning formatted URL, that's actually going to be handling entirely within the client. In the generate URL call, it actually returns a promise that resolves on that URL. So you want to have your handling there within that promise handler. The navigation mixin is again used in LWC. Pretty similar to the previous use case, you want to add a trackable property, in this case, record page URL, that you'll then assign that URL value to in the promise handler. And then you can then reference that trackable property within your template. And again, I would recommend using it with the Lightning formatted URL. All right, so page context. So in this case, we have a view that has a bunch of cards that are not in alphabetical order. When the user then selects ascending on this, the component notices that has actually done a navigation to add this query parameter on there and updates itself to show those cards in alphabetical order. So again, if they click on descending, it then shows it in descending order. You can also use this to pass page state along from one component to another. You can imagine this like in a wizard scenario. So if the user clicks on that mascot's card without changing that, it goes to the all. But if they provide it a specific mascot, it goes to that mascot's view, and then it notices that it has a record, and then forwards it onto the card, and so that the card can then display that. This also allows users to be able to create bookmarks using state. They can, you can imagine more complex scenarios than simply a sort. But if you have like maybe a set of filter parameters or whatever you want to do to manipulate the view, I can imagine this being in like a graph scenarios. You can make it so that all that is persisted within the URL, and so that users can then bookmark that and navigate directly back to the view that they want to see. And finally, URL addressable components. So you may have noticed these cards here. Whoops. These cards are directly navigatable. You go to /cmp/ the component name. That goes directly to that component. This doesn't require any admin to add a tab or anything. So how does this look like? So to get the page context into an Aura component, you want to implement Lightning has page reference. This will inject the page reference value into the component upon initialization. You actually don't have to explicitly define the attribute there, but I just showed it for reference. And then you want to have a change handler on that, so that any navigations that you do that maybe manipulate the state are then handled within your component so it can update its view. This is available within any Lightning component tab, Lightning component action overrides, utility bar items. And one thing I wanted to point out is that the page reference itself is frozen, so you don't want to change the page reference itself. You want to copy those attributes over and then do a navigate to that if you want to like update the state. The way this looks like in LWC is a little bit different. You use an @wire and then parameterize that around current page reference, and then you can have that either on a wired property or a wired function. If you have it on a wired property, that property will get updated anytime the page reference changes. If you have a function, that function will get called anytime that page reference gets updated. One thing to note about the method approach: if you do this and you want to use the navigation mixin, you need to ensure that the component is connected to the DOM. Otherwise, the navigation mixin call won't work. So what you can do is you can check to see if it is connected. If so, then do your navigation mixin call. Otherwise, queue it up or just wait until the connected callback is called. For URL addressable components and Aura, what you'll do is you'll implement Lightning as URL addressable. And then it actually inherits all the properties from has page reference. So you'll get the page reference. You want to have like a change handler on your on that page reference, and you can go. You can use it just the same as you did before, but now you can actually navigate to it directly using this general URL pattern. Unfortunately, in LWC, we don't have an equivalent functionality yet. So what we recommend you using is an Aura wrapper. So you use an Aura component that implements Lightning is URL addressable, and then you'll embed your LWC component within it, and then you can pass through a data binding the page reference if you want that inner LWC component to react to that. And then, of course, you want to have an API on that property. All right, so I'm going to give some tips. First of all, don't stop using the navigation events. Start using the navigation calls provided by Lightning Navigation. Stop hard-coding URLs. Use generate URL provided by the Lightning Navigation. You want to generate these URLs upon initialization so that any links that you have in there will have those URLs available to you as soon as the component is rendered. I recommend using Lightning formatted URL so that any click handling will be intercepted and it will end up doing a navigate call underneath. As I said before, if you don't do that, if you use a raw anchor, it will actually cause the browser to completely reload that page, which will be much slower. You want to stop parsing URLs and use has page reference, which will provide you the page reference component. You also want to use, if you're LWC, the current page reference at wire. And to navigate to a component, you want to stop using the navigate to component event and start using Lightning as URL addressable. And finally, please take advantage of deep linking and bookmarkable state. I think there's a lot of interesting and powerful things you can do with this. If you think about it, you can create wizard flows, all sorts of things with that. So a little bit on the roadmap. We have a few things coming up. In the coming winter 20 release, we'll have the ability to switch apps using page references. The way that looks like is there will be a standard app page type. You'll provide it a app ID or the developer name. And this will, like I said, this will be available in the winter 20 release. Default fill values of support in LWC. This replaces LWC equivalent to the force create record. Allows you to create custom components that override that default values when you create, I should say, creating a custom, creating a new entity. Supporting URL addressable components in LWC, as I mentioned before, we want to provide an LWC equivalent to is URL addressable. Custom link targets, which is the ability to have different behavior depending on what kind of app you're in. So for instance, we provide a target underscore new. If you're in console, maybe that'll open up in a workspace tab as opposed to a new browser tab. But if you're in a standard app, that'll open it up in a new browser tab. And finally, convenient link components. Instead of having to do all that boilerplate before I mentioned with the URL, we would like to make it so that you just provide a page reference and that a link will then just be generated for you automatically using that page reference instead of you having to have that boilerplate. Here are some resources. If you want to take a picture of this, these are all the Aura and LWC documentation links. And I also have the code that I used in the Mascots app there at the bottom. Unfortunately, it's all Aura code. I didn't have time to update it for LWC, but I still think it gives you a pretty good idea of what you can do. So unfortunately, I don't think we'll have enough time for questions, but we can take it off the stage. And if you have any other questions you think of later, you can email us. I can go back to that resource tab. I know some of you are trying to take pictures. Yeah.